Guten Tag, Dominik.
Guten Tag.
Willkommen zu diesem special...
Oh, your German's not great. I'm not sure we should try this in German.
Very rude. I mean, you're quite right. My German is nicht so good. So we won't do the whole episode in German. But we are going to be talking about Germany for this entire episode. Because you probably noticed, listeners, there's been a pretty big election this past week.
Yeah, and one of the most closely watched elections for Europe this year, I imagine. And it's an election that felt incredibly important for Germans themselves, which you can tell by the fact that the turnout was massive, 83.5%, a record for Germany since unification. So this election was a big deal. But at the same time, we've been struggling over the past few days to figure out exactly what to make of the results. What was your first reaction, Katie, when the exit polls dropped on Sunday evening?
I mean, honestly, I was just kind of like, oh. Because, the results were both shocking and not shocking at the same time. Like, not shocking in the sense that, to be honest, the results were pretty much what the pollsters had predicted.
For once.
For once. Good job, pollsters. But they were also shocking at the same time in that the far-right party, the AfD, came second with double the share of the vote that they got in the last federal elections 3 years ago.
Right, yeah. It's difficult to know to what extent we should be freaked out by what's just happened or relieved by it, especially seeing as the other mainstream parties are sticking to that cordon sanitaire, the long-running agreement that they will not go into government with the far right.
Yeah, I feel like that's kind of a good summary of this episode. Just how freaked out should we be?
Should be the title of the episode.
Good one. That is the main question that we will be trying to answer in this week's episode. We're also going to be asking a couple of others, namely, what is likely to happen next? And also, as human beings, how should we go about processing what is yet another piece of complicated and fairly depressing news in a world that seems to be full of complicated and fairly depressing things at the moment?
Yeah. There's definitely not a shortage of things to be concerned about right now. Mm-hmm. But fortunately, we're going to be unpicking this week with the help of two excellent guests. One of them is Tarik Abou-Chadi, Professor of European Politics at the University of Oxford. And then later in the show, we're going to be speaking to Emilia Roig, Berlin-based writer, thinker, specialist in intersectionality and anti-discrimination activist. Although she's actually someone who calls herself an activist only reluctantly. She prefers to think of herself as someone who can't accept the status quo. Emilia is French, but she's lived in Germany now for a couple of decades. And this week, in a week when a far-right party has managed to come alarmingly close to power, but isn't there yet, we thought it would be interesting to hear from someone who both is a long-term immigrant in Germany and someone who's dedicated their life to fighting against discrimination.
We will be talking to Emilia a little bit later, but first, let's hear from Tarik about the results of these crucially important elections themselves and what we should make of them.
Tarik, thank you so much for joining us today. I believe you're fresh back from Germany, where they've just 2 days ago had this big election. I wanted to first start by asking you, who do you think can feel satisfied after this election? Which politicians can feel like winners?
Yes, that's a very good question. And first of all, thanks for having me on the podcast. So the election result wasn't a big surprise because the polls were quite spot on. So a lot of reactions were kind of baked in already a little bit. Of course, what we saw is that all three parties that formed the last government, so the Social Democrats, the Greens, and the Free Democrats, they all lost votes in the elections. And basically all opposition parties gained votes. Now, the big winner in terms of vote gain is the far-right AfD. So they nearly doubled their result. They did very, very well. The strongest party is the Christian Democrats. So they're going to lead the next government. So they're naturally quite happy with the election result. But given how unpopular the government was, their election result with about 28% of the vote is actually not that great. It's their second worst historical result So while they will lead the next government, it's not an exceptional result. And finally, the big surprise was Die Linke, the left party, that was really already seen as a kind of dead party a couple of months ago. And they really outperformed expectations, and they did very, very well during the campaign, and then came out at over 8% of the vote.
As you say, the results could be seen as a pretty strong rejection of the three governing parties from the previous coalition, the SPD, the Greens, and the FDP. For those of us not living in Germany, why is the outgoing government so unpopular?
So there are several things that are coming together here. The first is that something that's nearly happened globally. Currently in elections, government parties are losing. This happens basically everywhere. And the main reason we give from a political science perspective is economics, inflation, really. So there's a rule of political science, really. When the economy is going down, people are more likely to support opposition parties. And inflation seems to be particularly strong in having this effect. We don't know so much about this because the last period where we had really strong inflation in Europe and North America is so long ago that usually when we test this idea about the relationship between the economy and government support, it's used unemployment rates and growth. But inflation really seems to make people very, very upset with the government, and so they become much more likely to support the opposition. A second thing is that there was a lot of infighting in the coalition, a lot of things that they didn't get done. The chancellor was seen as a bit too passive, not involved enough. And so the government just didn't really work well together, which is the second reason why it was unpopular. And maybe a third one, as a result of Russia's invasion in Ukraine, especially energy prices went up a lot in Germany. Again, there's this relationship with inflation, but this really hit every aspect of German social, economic, and political life quite hard. And so again, although the government found some solution, it was just not a great situation to be in.
The most likely coalition seems to be between the two legacy mainstream parties, the CDU, CSU, and the SPD. But I can't help but wondering, with what you just said about how much the previous coalition had all this infighting, it seems like those two parties are likely to have just as much infighting, if not more. Do the SPD, do the Social Democrats actually want to be in government? And who's holding the cards in these coalition negotiations?
So the German Social Democrats like being in government a lot. They governed 23 out of the last 27 years. So they've been in government a lot, and they seem very likely to join this government coalition again. In contrast to the last coalition, those two parties have governed together a lot in the past 15 years. So those so-called grand coalition, not so grand anymore now, but it used to be called grand coalitions, that was a quite regular outcome of elections as a government in the past 20 years. And this so-called traffic light coalition that we had, that was really a new attempt, and those parties had never governed together. It was also the first time that it was three parties governing together. And so that had challenges that apparently they weren't really used to. So in a way, one has a bit the feeling that the natural partners are getting back together, and they seem very prepared to do this.
With this result giving the AfD nearly 21% of the total vote, you could arguably say that they have effectively now become a kind of mainstream political party themselves, despite being under surveillance by the intelligence services for extremism. How can those of us outside Germany understand the process by which that became possible?
There are two crucial mechanisms leading to the normalization of a far-right party. The first is positional accommodation. So what that means is that established parties move toward the far right on certain issues, especially on the issue of immigration. So when established parties emphasize immigration, speak of immigration mostly as a problem, and promote more restrictive measures, this really normalizes the position on the rhetoric of the far right. That's the first mechanism. And the second is then something like direct collaboration. So a lot of European countries used to have something that we like to call a cordon sanitaire around the far right. So just a rule of non-collaboration with the far right. When this crumbles, then again, this legitimizes the far right. And so we've seen this step by step in the German context, where there still is a quite strong cordon sanitaire, much stronger than, for example, in the Netherlands or in Austria, but it has started to crumble. And again, this has given the far right this normalization. And then a third factor is as self-reinforcing one, which is electoral success, right? When you see that the party is successful, then it must somehow be more normal. When there are dozens of newspaper articles or news pieces on why is the AfD doing so well, then for many people, what they see is, oh, the AfD must be doing well, so maybe me supporting it isn't so wrong anymore. So the stigma around these parties disappears.
One of the German politicians who's been criticized for coming close to collaborating with the AfD on certain bills is Friedrich Merz, the man who leads the Christian Democrats and who is likely to be chancellor now. What kind of chancellor do you think he will be?
So my assessment of this has really changed in the last months, I would say. It was always clear that Friedrich Merz would be very conservative, like old school conservative, reactionary type. You know, every time he talks about women, it's either wives or daughters, or it's a very old school conservative politician.
Definitely not the new Merkel.
No, exactly. And really moving the party away from where Angela Merkel was. So I thought he's that, but still somewhat principled. So not this new kind of lying, populist, opportunist type of right-wing politician that we see increasingly across the world. However, throughout the last months, I think we've seen that he is very willing to use these similar tactics to increase support. We've seen this around this vote in the Bundestag that you already mentioned, where they pushed a motion through with the support of the AfD. So my assessment there has really changed, and that has made me very pessimistic about where he's going to go with the country in this regard.
And in terms of what he actually wants to do policy-wise, I mean, how much of a plan does he have for fixing the problems, the kind of problems that voters have been flagging during this election campaign?
Yes, so Germany has a big problem in the sense that it's very clear that there's certain types of spending that they want to increase, especially defense spending, which I think the reason for why they want to do this is clear. But it's not so easy because in Germany, constitutionally, there's a so-called debt brake. And without going into too much detail about this, the idea is that there's a limit to what you can do spending-wise and how much debt you can make as a government. So if you can't increase debt, then you only have two other options. You can cut spending or you increase taxes. So you increase income. And the CDU has already said that it's unwilling to reform the debt brake and to increase taxes, which would mean spending cuts, which the Social Democrats are unlikely to accept. And also the spending cuts that the CDU-CSU has proposed will be nowhere close to enough to get the money in that they would need to increase defense spending in this way.
So yeah, defense is one of the big things that's been a topic during the campaign and something that a lot of outsiders across Europe are looking at as Germany, the biggest economy in Europe. But there are a lot of other things that are also very important in Germany. I mean, for example, climate change or housing that don't seem to have got much attention during this election campaign. And I mean, now that we're presumably going to get this CDU-SPD government, do you think they'll be able to do anything about these issues that weren't political priorities during the campaign?
It's a very good question. We really have not seen these issues on the agenda in the last months in the campaign at all. During all of the debates, the issue of climate change really didn't come up at all, which is a massive failure not only of the politicians involved, but also of the media, given that just objectively climate change is going to be a huge challenge and there's no way around it. And the one issue that really dominated everything was immigration. And that is really unfortunate, given that it's really taking away space to debate these fundamental issues that Germany has to solve. And these weren't tested during the campaign. So it's very difficult to say what is the exact plan of these parties, because of course they have something in their programs. but it hasn't really been debated in a way that would give citizens or even more, professional observers like me a good sense of where things are going to go.
I mean, the parties that you would normally expect to be pushing those kind of issues and putting them front and center of their campaigns generally tend to be parties on the left. Most of the reporting about how these elections have gone has focused on the right-wing parties. Can you tell us a bit more about what has actually happened on the left in this election? Are there any left-wing politicians who you think can actually feel pretty pleased with the results?
Yeah, so we have three parties more or less on the left in Germany: the Social Democrats, the Greens, and the Left Party. And so the Social Democrats have really shifted to a very managerial, centrist type of political position over the last years. Olaf Scholz was really the epitome of this, but I already mentioned they're in government so often that really governing has become their ideology to a certain degree. The Greens have been this very successful challenger in Germany for this, you could say, hegemony on the left. And they did very well in the last election. They are still quite close to the Social Democrats in terms of their vote shares, also in many regions. So they're really competing for the first spot. However, what this has resulted in is the Greens also strongly focusing on the political center. And the Greens have passed a lot of policies. They've contributed to these draconian measures against asylum seekers, where a lot of progressive voters did not feel represented by the party anymore. And this is the reason why the Linke, the left party, has been so successful in this election, because they were able to get to these voters. They had a very principled position on immigration, also on Gaza, at least much more than other German parties. And these were really issues that progressives and especially young people cared about a lot. And so they could really channel this sentiment. And this is why they've been so successful in this election.
I've been finding it quite difficult to work out how depressed to feel about these election results, considering the picture is quite mixed. And I mean, compared to where I live in the Netherlands, as you've already mentioned, the far right are already in power, and that doesn't seem like it's going to happen in Germany. So from the kind of Dutch perspective, I kind of feel like I can breathe a sigh of relief almost that it wasn't worse. Do you think that's reasonable to think that these set of results can be seen as kind of not as bad as they could have been?
It's true that they're not as bad as it could have been, but they're pretty bad. I mean, it's an election with very high turnout. We haven't had turnout this high in decades. And still we had over 20% voting for a far-right party that is really far to the right. Right? This is kind of strong neo-Nazi ties type of party. And that is frightening. And that in combination with a political establishment on the center-left and center-right that has really moved to the right as well, trying to accommodate these positions. And we've seen this in all other countries that, slowly, this just helps to legitimize the far-right and gets them into these positions of power. The difference between the Netherlands and Germany is just Germany is a bit of a latecomer. People often emphasize German history in this regard. That might be the case, but it might not. The fact is just we've started a little later in Germany. But the Netherlands, this has been going on for 25 years now, these kinds of debates. And so the far right is so normalized, which you could see in the last election. And in Germany, Germany's just a bit of a laggard, but Germany seems very much on the same track as many other countries in Europe at the moment, which is why I'm unfortunately not very optimistic or relieved by this election.
In terms of what actually happens next, Tarik, can you talk us through it? When can we actually expect a new government to be in place?
They're determined to do it very quickly. So Friedrich Merz talks about Easter, which I guess would be in less than 2 months. And usually these coalition negotiations can go on for quite a while. But there is a sense of urgency. There's also this allows the parties to reduce the intra-party conflict around potentially joining a coalition, saying we have to do this now, we have this global responsibility, is of course a good way to also shut down intra-party debate if one should join a coalition. So I think given the context, it could go quite quickly. There also only really is one option. And so this should make it faster.
You're a professor of European politics. So if we look at this like in the broader European perspective, do you see any sign that we might be reaching peak far right in Europe anytime soon? Or is there any hint of the tide turning, or any parts of the continent where you feel we can be a bit more optimistic yet?
Unfortunately, the answer is no.
Thanks a lot, Tarik. So glad we invited you here today.
If you want good news, I'm not the best person to have on your podcast, unfortunately. No, so I mean, right, we're seeing things getting worse nearly everywhere. I think the only country that still sticks out as a bit of an exception is Spain. But in most countries, the far right is gaining. Of course, we saw this big change in Poland, but also what Poland shows is that the far right doesn't disappear just because they've lost one election.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so internationally, Trump and Musk are going to disappear at some point, but what they stand for isn't going to magically disappear. And they showed what you can do with this agenda and how you can get power. And, why wouldn't other rich people do the same thing as Elon Musk has done now? And so, unfortunately, my outlook there is very pessimistic, and I can't say anything else, unfortunately.
Yeah, my one personal hope, which may be completely unfounded, is that I feel like still a lot of Europeans find Trump and Musk repulsive. Also, some who might be tempted to vote for the far right. And I was a tiny bit pleased that even when JD Vance and Musk were endorsing the AfD didn't see much bump in the polls after that. So I don't know whether that's anything to be excited about, but...
So, of course, there are national flavors to what these politicians do and what is popular and not popular. And I think people are repulsed by Trump and Musk also because of questions of style and some aspects of their politics. And let's be clear, JD Vance is a fascist, and this is something I don't use as an expression a lot for contemporary politics. But this is the version we're talking about. So Geert Wilders might not be a fascist, and he may just understand his country a bit better in terms of what he can say publicly and what he just won't say. But that distinction isn't making me particularly optimistic. What's making me optimistic maybe is that in Germany still we have seen these large protests, and people are willing to organize, and they're willing to fight, and civil society is ready to do it. The frustrating thing, and many activists and civil society actors have told me this, the frustrating thing for these actors has been that they didn't feel represented at the political level anymore. What they say is, we know the far right, we know how to fight the far right, but we are lacking political actors that really take our concerns into account and not are all focusing on how to get these far right voters back by appeasing the far right, really.
I mean, is that the main thing that you see as needing to change if there is to be any hope in stopping the far right from actually reaching power in Germany? If we look ahead to 5 years' time, Alice Weidel, the leader of the AfD, she said that she wants the party to be the biggest by the next elections. And if you look at the trajectory, it seems like she might get that wish. I mean, what do other parties do? What do other political actors do to stop that from happening?
The most important thing is you have to uphold a cordon sanitaire. You cannot collaborate with these parties. As soon as you do, you really open the floodgates. And people on the right then basically ask themselves, why should I not vote for this party over the mainstream right one? And you very clearly saw this in the Netherlands in the last electoral campaign. This isn't enough, of course. The left needs its own program. The left needs to, again, stand for a vision of the future that is not just some managerial problem solving, but actually an idea of inclusive societies that deal with the massive amounts of economic inequality, and they need to be confident and really get back into the business of shaping people's opinions and identities. So what I always say kind of provocatively is that the left doesn't do enough identity politics. The left has given up on shaping people's identities, actually. And they're especially currently just too scared to do it because they think it'll have negative electoral consequences.
So there was a clear answer that there is nothing to be hopeful about.
But at least some sort of a direction forward in terms of what needs to be done. That's like, it's not hopeful, but it is constructive.
I have to say, as someone who descends from people who were murdered during the Holocaust by this country, Germany, it does feel pretty shocking that millions of Germans are starting to vote for a party that has pretty extreme far-right views.
Yeah. And when you look at that map and how many places, like, you know, this whole swathe of the east of the country where the AfD came top, it is just so chilling.
Yeah.
Even if there are, you know, it is important to remember hundreds of thousands of people who have taken to the streets because they are so repulsed to see this.
Yeah.
I don't know. One of the main things that I'm feeling really anxious about coming out of this is that, like, it does feel like this moment where it's like, okay, this is mainstream politics' last chance to show that it can deliver, like, betterment for people's lives in a way that convinces them, you know what, I don't need to vote for this far-right party. Things are going actually better than they were last year or the year before. But, you know, when you look at, like, what is going to be in the in tray of this government or any government really in the world right now, you know, we are dealing with the climate crisis. We are dealing with, like, huge levels of inequality, rising inequality. The thought of any government made up of mainstream parties, and these are probably going to be the two legacy mainstream parties going back into power, the thought of them trying to do that and succeeding is making me feel really pretty anxious.
And you haven't even talked about the fact that Putin is emboldened by support from the US, who've been Europe's long-term security backup.
Yeah, well, I don't really need any extra things to feel anxious about, so thanks for that.
My pleasure.
Adding it to my list. Speaking of anxiety, how to deal with the anxiety arising from these elections and many other global events at the moment is one of the things that we talked about with our second guest in this German bonanza of an episode, the writer and activist Emilia Roig. Emilia has made a bit of a splash recently with a book that she wrote called Lieben, or Loving. I was kind of surprised when you suggested that we speak to Emilia after these elections, Dominic. What was it that made you want to talk to somebody who writes about love this week?
Well, I should say Emilia is also a political scientist. And of course, it's important to look at the political and parliamentary ramifications of a vote and all the geopolitical implications around it. And I'm really pleased we've spoken to Tarik. But I also think this podcast is at its best when we're looking at issues from a kind of different angle to other outlets. I discovered Emilia whilst listening to the podcast of a former guest of ours, Soya the drag cow.
Oh, yeah.
Big super fan of Soya still. They've got a podcast called The Meltdown. And I loved how she quite calmly and eloquently analysed many of the things that are going wrong in society, looking beyond purely the political realm. So, yeah, I was thrilled that Emilia was up for coming to join us and to share her reactions to the German election.
Emilia, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So we are speaking to you on Monday, the day after the elections in Germany. How are you feeling?
I'm feeling very disheartened, very anxious, and angry.
Was it kind of a feeling and a set of results that you expected, or is there any surprise in how the results are or how you're responding to them?
No, I'm not surprised at all. Actually, I've been preparing for this for months. And yet when it really happens, when it becomes reality, when there's no little escape door for me to, imagine another outcome, then it hits differently. So I guess this is what happened yesterday. And I saw it and I was like, okay, what is it going to change for us, for our lives, for our feeling of safety, for, the planning of the future? There are a lot of consequences.
I mean, we were talking as a team the other day, and our producer, Wojciech, he put things probably the most simply I've heard them put recently. He said that it feels like the bad guys have been winning. And when I think about your work and what you stand for and what you fight for, intersectionality, giving more power to marginalized groups, fighting discrimination, those don't feel like ideas that are winning at the moment. I mean, do you also feel like that, or are you more hopeful about this stuff than I am?
So there are different levels, right? I mean, there's the level of discourse. And on the level of discourse, these ideas are not winning at all. Like actually, even, sometimes when people say my bio out loud and what I'm teaching at university, namely postcolonial studies or gender studies, it feels like those words have been really discredited so much that it feels uncomfortable for me to have my bio listed out. So on the level of discourse, for sure, we are not winning. But on a deeper level and on the level of transformation, I think what we're seeing as well is that this backlash, or the last hiccup before the death of a system, is that it dies very loudly, right? So looking at it from the angle of, the bad guys are winning, I think on the one hand, this is what it seems like. But if we take a bit of a leap behind or look at the situation from above and with a bit more hindsight, what we see is that this backlash is also the expression of a very deep transformation, of deep change that is happening. And this is essentially resistance to it.
That's quite like a nice, hopeful way of looking at it. But I know like just day to day, a lot of people around me, and myself included a bit, kind of want to just tune out of the news at the moment because it seems like so much is so bleak. I imagine you are not in a position where you can do that because of your work and your practice. But do you have any tips for how people can get through these rather dark times and how they can process and stay engaged with this fight and with the news despite some pretty scary political results?
So first of all, I mean, it's not only because of my work and my practice, but also of who I am as a person, because, people like me are directly targeted by right-wing populism and, neo-Nazi policies, we can call it this way. And so that's why, it's difficult to just take a break from it. And so I think what is helpful is to understand crisis situations and understand, okay, why are we in this situation right now? And what can we do against it? And it's not about reading the news. To be honest, I never read the news. I never read the news. This is not a practice of mine. And nevertheless, I'm very well informed on the state of the world. I have a very strong opinion about it. I know what is going on. But I find, and especially in times of rising fascism, reading the news and listening to it and being captive of the ways in which news are being told is part of the problem. So take a hindsight and try to look at the situation from above, try to understand it from a larger angle, understanding that what is happening now is not a defining moment. It's not a finite moment. It's not the end of the story.
How do you stay informed if it's not by reading the news?
So I read more longer pieces, so I read books and, in essentially what is happening. So if I need to know something about what is happening, it's enough to know it. Okay, Trump did this, the election results is that, this new law was passed. So it's enough. These are facts. The problem with the news is that it's not just telling us what happens. It just tells it from a specific perspective. And it gives an opinion to it, even though it is presented as being neutral, right? So in order to stay informed, it's more about my analytical skills, about how do I analyze the situation. I have facts, and what does it say about what is currently taking place? And for this, I don't need to read so many articles about what's going on. I need to read books that have been written before. I need to know, for example, political analysis about past systems that, may be reminiscent of what's going on now. Yeah. This is how I do it.
Well, since you mentioned history, I think the role that history has played in this election campaign has been quite interesting. Germany is often praised internationally for having this strong culture of remembrance, the way that the country reflects on this horrific history of genocidal crimes during the Second World War. But looking at how this campaign has gone and how the results have gone, I can't help but think that something has gone wrong here. And Germany's relationship with its history just isn't as reflective as a lot of us often think it is internationally. Does it feel to you like something has gone wrong there?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I've been saying this for many years, actually. The ways in which Germany has been dealing with its past is very selective. It's very self-interested. The fact that it's been shown as an example worldwide, I mean, I fell for it too, right? When I arrived in Germany 20 years ago, I also thought that it was an example to be followed by other nations, especially France, right? I come from a country that doesn't do this work. And at the same time, if you go closer and try to look at what it actually means and how Germany has confronted its past, some things were good if you look at it, especially in the field of symbolic remembrance, I would say. But when it comes to really analyzing and truly understanding why it could happen, it did a terrible job because it was very exceptionalized, looking at Hitler as a single figure. So the demonization of Hitler, for example, and also not looking at the Third Reich as part of a larger history that started long before 1933, right? So we're speaking about decades and decades of indoctrination, decades and decades of anti-Semitism, decades and decades of colonial racism and imperialism and scientific racism that was not only confined to German borders, but also a transnational system, right? There was a lot of communication between, let's say, scientists, pseudo-scientists, we would say today, in North America and in the rest of European countries. And I will not delve into the topic of reparations and geopolitical interest in that, but Germany has heavily relied on the establishment of Israel as a state to deal with its culpability. Guilt. That's a major issue, right? Because when it comes to the victims, the Roma and Sinti victims, for example, almost nothing was done for them. And it was recognized as a crime against humanity in 1982 after decade-long tireless work and activism by the very communities that were the victims of this genocide too. So I could go on and on and on why the memory work of Germany is not to be praised, but to be seen with criticism. But I will stop here.
Well, if we look forward to how things could get better, you recently wrote a book in German called Lieben, or Loving. And I wanted to ask, how do you think loving can help us in these difficult times? And do we need to rethink how and who we are loving?
Lieben, or loving, is always going to be part of the solution. So I think what we need to understand is that right now we have bought into an understanding of loving that is very ingrained in capitalist thinking, that is about consumption, consuming love, and also something that cannot be generated endlessly, but more something that is tied to status, relationship status, or the couple, the romantic couple. And love can help us simply because what we will need is collective structures of community. What will help us is solidarity. And in that sense, when we see that the state is going to be a source of tremendous violence and is already a source of tremendous violence, if we look at migrants dying at sea as an example, then the people who are currently helping them are fueled by love, right? And by the desire to help, by the desire to recognize our shared humanity, by the desire to recognize that we cannot be free if not all of us are free. I think, a new way of looking at love as a generative force, as something that can generate power for our collective liberation.
I watched an Instagram video that you posted the other day where you said that electoral politics is not the solution to everything that's going wrong right now. What did you mean by that? And if electoral politics isn't, the main part of the solution or the solution full stop, then what is?
So electoral politics was a system, or is a system, that served us for many decades and was necessary in the evolution of our governance systems. But currently, we can very clearly say that it has reached a point where it is no longer serving the interest of the majority, even though to date, we don't have a better system. We think we don't have a better system to make democratic decisions. But what we can see is that it is so deeply ingrained in a capitalist logic enmesh with capitalist interests and also self-interest. Party politics is very far away from representing democratic interest. We see that a lot of decision-making that is taking place is not really aligned with what people actually want. If you would ask people, okay, do you want war? Do you want a few people to have most of the wealth in the entire world and other people to starve? I believe in the good in humanity. And so that's why I think this system is reaching a point of no return where collectively we will come to the conclusion that no, it is not the system that can better serve us. I think through this system, automatically we're giving a lot of power to elected politicians and thinking that we don't have power anymore. And I think that's something we need to reflect on and understand, that authoritarianism is being implemented exactly because we have so much power. Maybe realizing this can be empowering as well, to know that it's not because the elections turned out this way that it's the end of the world, and we don't have to accept it. And I know that it's difficult in a country like Germany, a country that is not revolutionary, a country that has such a hard time disobeying and standing up against power. Yeah, it is a difficult thing to grasp, actually, or at least to embody.
You've written that one of the problems with the times that we live in is our obsession with control and predictability and not knowing the future. I think I'm one of those people who is especially anxious about the state of the world right now, specifically because the future feels so unknown, maybe more than it ever has done in my adult lifetime. This is perhaps a slightly needy question, but how would you advise me to deal with that?
So anxiety is a somatic experience, even if we feel like it all happens in our heads, but nevertheless, it just makes us very tense in our bodies. And so something that I practice, I'm also very worried, right? It may sound like I have everything under control and that, I'm not addicted to certainty. I am very addicted to certainty too, right? So this is something I practice myself. And it's really to anchor yourself in the present, because what only matters now is the present. At the same time, of course, we can make decisions geared towards the future, but most of our anxiety is very unproductive, right? It's not helping us make constructive decisions for the future. It's not helping us anticipate danger. It's just paralyzing us, right? So what I do is really anchor myself in the present. And I do that by very simple things. When I feel that I start worrying, it's really about really focusing on everything I do in the here and now. Okay, what can I do now? What is my situation right now? What is the current danger? What is a danger that is rationally explainable and not something that I anticipate in the future? And so you have different methods of doing this. For example, looking at 3 things you can see, 2 things you can smell, 1 thing you can taste, all of those things of somatic practice that anchors you in the present.
That feels like really good advice. I need to get much, much better at this. I'm so bad at this stuff.
Yeah. Yesterday, there was a moment of sun and I was out in the garden and just focusing on the plants. And it was the first time I'd felt really calm in my head for weeks with all the chaos going on. I thought, okay, this maybe isn't helping the bigger picture, but I'm at least helping this bit of land, and some bugs are going to be happy. Like sometimes we have to focus on the small things.
Exactly. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Not to sound too negative, Dominic, but your ability to do this more often, doesn't that depend on the sun actually coming out in the Netherlands?
It's true. I should move somewhere else. That's probably the answer. Anyway, Emilia, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Emilia. That was one of these rare interviews for the Europeans where we were actually in the same place for a change, Dominic.
We were. Katie, along with 2 of our producers, came to Amsterdam for 24 hours, arriving on Sunday night.
Yeah, so that we could digest the German election results together. Fun
Exactly.
times.
To digest those results together, but also to do a lot of planning for some exciting things that are coming in the months ahead. On which note, there is no podcast next week. We're taking a week off. But look out for 2 episodes the week after, one of which will be a mini episode in which we'll be telling you a little bit more about some of those things that we're cooking up.
Intriguing. In the meantime, if you'd like to see some social media content of me running on my tiny little short legs, trying to catch up with my giant colleagues, Dominic, Katch and Wojciech in Amsterdam, come and join us on Instagram. We are also on Blue Sky. Just type in Europeans Podcast and you should find us.
Sorry we walked too fast for you.
Story of my life.
Anyway, a very big thank you to Tarik and Emilia for joining us for this special German election debrief this week. And a big Dankeschön to Wojciech Oleksiak and Morgan Childs for producing this episode.
We'll be back the week after next. Cheers.
Auf Wiedersehen.